attorney. He told me at the time of the purchase, Mr. Dow did not appear impaired in any way. The dealership says it met with family members on November 25th and offered to buy back the vehicle and notify the family that the check is ready to pick up.
I would like his money back. I would like to make him whole. That's what the dealership should do. Make him whole.
And Faulkner says the dealership has offered them an offer. However, she says it does not include the value of that traded Nissan that her stepfather turned in at this dealership. Reporting live tonight in Kennesaw, Ashley Lincoln, Channel 2 Action News.
A Gainesville man is facing felony chop shop charges. Deputies say they found parts for a stolen all-terrain vehicle and motorcycle at Wesley Aldridge's home on Friday. They got a tip and said they located the vehicle identification number for the ATV on some parts. They say they later found a disassembled motorcycle. The suspect is out of jail on bond.
The federal agency, the Emergency Management Agency, could make major staffing cuts this year. An internal FEMA email to senior leaders warned about possible cuts in the coming year. The agency is reportedly looking at
problem. There was some communication problems getting the word out on the internet, but also here at Johnson Ferry Church, there was a mistake, and so very few people here at the church were notified of our new course. So hopefully that'll be rectified, and next week, there'll be more people aware of what we're doing. I'm very much looking forward to this course that we're going to be covering over the next couple of months and more. America's mixed heritage, the Christian and the secular influences in the founding and development of the American nation. And as I wrote in an initial announcement, there's always been a tremendous amount of misinformation regarding the major influences on the development of America. Many Christians have tended to sanitize our past. That's not intellectually, honest, to say the least. And then many secularists really distort our history in order to push a left-wing neo-Marxist agenda. And obviously that's not intellectual or morally accurate either. So we hope to set the record straight. I think you'll find it to be very substantive and hopefully very edifying, and in some respect, at least, very edifying. We are very, very fortunate, as you know, very privileged to live in America, which in so many ways is probably the greatest nation in all of human history. Now, our history obviously has many, many flaws, and we want to deal honestly with all of that. But when all is said and done, it's just a tremendous blessing that we have. The last couple of years, in particular, I've been in close contact with some Christians in Pakistan, and I tell you, most every month there's a new challenge that comes up to threaten their lives and their security and destroy the country. And so I know that we need to be in prayer for these for people like that scattered all over the world, as Millie mentioned, and also pray that God will touch our hearts and lead us to support people like that who so desperately need help. They're trying to live Christian lives in the midst of a very, very hostile society and culture. And as in the case of our friends in Pakistan, their lives are oftentimes threatened because of their beliefs. So much to be grateful for. And I'm looking forward to going through this material with you. Now, when I sent out the introduction or syllabus for this course, I made a few comments that I'd like to emphasize before we move on. And I wrote, quote, The summer of 2026 will mark the semi-quincentennial. I'm sure that's a term you've used all the time. Semi-quincentennial. Well, that means every half 500 years. In other words, this will be the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. And for many Americans, this will be a time of great celebration, but also, and we see this in the news all the time, for many Americans, this is a time for mourning. On both sides, there will be considerable misinformation regarding America's past. Some Americans, including many Christians, are prone to sanitize our nation's past, while others regard much of our history as very, very shameful and the product of violence, nothing but violence and conquest and racism and exploitation, greed, social justice, and social injustice, and so on. So, what are the facts? And to what extent was America influenced both by biblical Christian principles, but also by secular and Enlightenment social and political ideals? It was influenced a lot by both. This course will explore those and other similar questions honestly and factually, in keeping with the realities of our national history. Now, this is a condensation of an in-depth course that I've taught over a period of nearly 7 years here at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church on Sunday mornings, a class that we call A History of Christianity in America. And in this study, we explore the most significant and influential individuals, issues, and events in American Christian history, so as to broaden and deepen our understanding of our nation's past. The United States of America has been the most consequential nation in world history for more than 100 years, and it has also been a major center for the spread of Christianity worldwide as well. So again, so much to celebrate and be thankful for, and take it very, very seriously. Why are we among the, in many respects, elite in the world? Only 6% of the world population lives here in America. 94% do not. And so we are exceedingly privileged. And, those to whom much is given, much is required, as Scripture tells us. So we're not here just to enjoy life to the fullest, and to the extent that we're unaware of our responsibilities to not only others in our country, but throughout the world as well. So anyway, I hope you'll find this to be a very substantive course, very relevant, very significant, as we deal with a lot of the questions and issues that have been much debated and oftentimes misrepresented in American Christian history. So any comments before we launch into our study? Anything? Yes, Millie?
I just made an observation watching the Ken Burns series and
on the American Revolution. Yes, we saw it.
Watched it, but hardly any mention of God at all, or even the providence of God.
Yeah.
Very little. I kept thinking about what you have taught us, how sort of the Presbyterian, it could be a Presbyterian revolution. Hardly anything mentioned there.
Yeah.
In that series. And then just a couple
in progress.
Vance was calling us a Christian nation. Right. And I just cringed. Yeah. And I'm thinking, this is the vice president of the United States.
Right.
And if this is a Christian nation, oh my. So I'm looking forward to this class.
Thank you. I am too. And, when we make the distinction between America being founded as a, quote, Christian nation, as opposed to being founded as a Christian influenced nation, that means a lot, okay? Because there has been so much violence, injustice, and so on in our history, as with every nation's history. And so we certainly do not want to attribute that to the fact that we are a, quote, Christian nation. Now, when you think about it, in American history, more Protestant Christians have been slaughtered by other Protestant Christians than probably any other country in world history. That's the Civil War, in which at least 650, if not more than 700,000 Americans were slaughtered, many of them Protestant Christians by other Protestant Christians. So we want to be very cautious how we, describe our history, so as not in any way to impinge upon the credibility of the Christian faith. But it has been an influence in America, and that's a great deal to be very, very thankful for. So anything else? Any other comments? Yes, Gordon.
There's like a minority report, Alexis de Tocqueville made comments about what he saw when he came to this.
Yeah.
That kind of counters what you're saying.
Well, he was
Patrick Henry.
Yeah.
Made it. And he was in the center of all the formation of the movement. So
yeah.
That's also counter to what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, I'll counter what they said. Say Tocqueville comes out of well, obviously he's French.
Yeah.
And so his whole context for Christianity is French Catholicism. And a point that I'll come back to probably from time to time is for the first 300 years of Christian history, Christians were severely discriminated against, sometimes outright persecuted, and so on. And then we get to the first emperor who at least declares himself to be a Christian, whether he was or not, and that's Constantine. And Constantine is not the one who made Christianity the official religion of the empire. That was one of his successors about 50 years later. That was Theodosius. But for Constantine, he certainly favored Christianity in certain respects. And so beginning with Constantine in the early 300s, so we're talking about 1700 years ago or so, Rome became eventually officially a Christian empire. But to say it was officially a Christian empire, again, has nothing credible necessarily to say about the state of spirituality in the Roman Empire. And from that point on, though, and by the way, up to that point, Christians, as you know, had been persecuted viciously. Well, once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, guess what? The tables turn, and now it's pagans who are being persecuted. And not just pagans, but oftentimes in certain parts of the Roman Empire, it's Jews who are being persecuted by the so-called Christians. They call Jews oftentimes the killers of Christ. And so that was the pretext for discriminating against Jews. So that leads us into this 1700-year period in which Europe is generally referred to as the realm of Christendom. And what you have there is the union of church and state, something that America's founding fathers were opposed to for good reasons. We'll talk about that. But this unholy alliance of church and state meant that essentially, like all state religions, Christianity was expected to serve the interests of the politicians, the government officials. And so it's a very turbulent, in some ways, really disgusting history. And so that is the pretext for, the founding of America and so on. Now, fortunately, with founding of America, there are a few who come over who understand that Christianity is exclusively a spiritual relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. And it's a voluntary, commitment. It can't be forced on other people. And so you have those like Roger Williams and, William Penn and people like that who understood the true nature of the faith. And that is, we have absolutely no right to persecute or discriminate against or try to force other people to become Christians. And fortunately, those views were accepted to some extent by our founding fathers. And so we have the disestablishment of state churches. 9 of the 13 colonies had official state churches. Here in Georgia, it was, the Anglican or later Episcopal Church. And so eventually, and not long after the founding of the American nation, those state churches are disestablished. And thank God that's the case, because we need to celebrate religious liberty. And so there were influential forces in American society from the beginning who understood that. And we are the beneficiaries of it. Well, let me go through a slide presentation that I had put together. And we are. By the way, many of you are familiar with the Ministry of the Areopagus, all the seminars and forums all over the years. We focus on everything from biblical studies, bibliology, basically, to we do a lot with Christian history, with Christian apologetics, also with cultural apologetics, in that we never shy away from addressing contemporary social, political, cultural issues. We need to speak out on all these matters. And then, of course, we've done courses in Christian spirituality, science and the Christian faith, literature and the arts, and so on. So this is our, I believe, 23rd year that the Areopagus has been in effect. And so I'm so grateful, for all the wonderful people that we've been able to interact with over the years, and hopefully have had an influence on their spiritual growth and development. All right, so we're going to be talking about America's mixed heritage, the Christian and the secular influences in the founding and development of the American nation. All right. Now, I put together this graphic. I always need a lot of help when it comes to graphic designs and so on, and there was nobody available at the time. So this isn't the most creative graphic, but it does serve our purpose. And some of the influencers in American history, some were Christians, some certainly not Christians. But let's go through this. The upper left-hand corner, the statue, that is Roger Williams, okay, who probably doesn't get nearly enough attention for his great contributions. And again, somebody who believed very strongly in religious freedom and was very opposed to religious, compulsion, which was common during that time. We have Martin Luther King, obviously, next to him. Now, Martin Luther King, we're going to be talking a lot about him in our Sunday morning class. And of course, he did make great contributions in certain areas of American society, civil rights, and so on. Now, theologically, he's extremely liberal and was miseducated in college and seminary by some of the most rabid liberals in America at the time. So here's somebody who reportedly did not believe in the resurrection of Christ. He seriously doubted the incarnation of Christ and so on. So in his Christianity is very much, I think, by our standards, very much in question. Nonetheless, he was very influential. Okay. So certainly one of the most influential individuals in the 20th century. Next to him is, like me, I don't know his name either. And that's just basically a model representing the Pilgrims, maybe William Bradford, or somebody like that. Next to him, obviously, Washington. Next to him, Jefferson, okay, and then coming down, the I want you for the U.S. Army recruitment poster. Next to that is Theodore Roosevelt. Yes. And next to him would be William Penn. Yeah, who again doesn't get nearly enough credit for his contributions. Next to William Penn would be Booker T.
I read his book.
Did you?
Everyone should read. It's very inspirational.
Oh, he was.
Teenagers should read. Very, very inspirational.
He was truly a great man, and should be more better known than he has been in recent decades. Next to him is the Time magazine cover story in I think this was 1972. And this was talking about the Jesus Revolution, the Jesus movement, and so on. And so Jesus finally, after all these years, became a star. Okay, he made the cover of Time magazine. Okay, next to him is Woody Allen. Okay, and then coming back down on the left, Bob Dylan. Okay, and next to him, Schaefer, Lincoln, Billy Graham. Okay. Oh, we missed one. Sorry. A very, very important person. Who is this? That's George Soros. That is George Soros. And who has been probably the foremost promoter of some of the most evil, movements and all of the 21st century, and yet extremely influential, unfortunately. Okay, so George Soros. All right, then we came down to Woody Allen, over to Bob Dylan, Francis Schaeffer, Lincoln, Billy Graham. Next, Kennedy. Yeah, Kennedy. And then going back to the bottom down there Franklin Roosevelt, John Wayne, and then perhaps two of my favorite people in American history, Laurel and Hardy. Okay. And then, of course, the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. And then the next, William F. Buckley Jr. Okay. And then in the corner, Clarence Thomas. Yeah. Okay. Where's Elvis? Well, Elvis left the building. Okay, Bruce said. Elvis could very well be on be previewed there. Yeah. Oh, that's just a Minuteman, just representative of the Minutemen, of Lexington and Concord and the beginning of the American Revolution. Yeah, I don't know his name, but so anyway, just kind of a hodgepodge of significant people, mostly for the better, but some absolutely for the worse. George Soros obviously stands out in that regard. Okay. All right. So the major topics we'll take up in this course over the next several weeks. We'll start tonight with a preface, prefatory comments and so on, setting the stage. And then primarily next week, we'll look at the origins of America's culture war, contemporary culture war. Now, I realize that term culture war is one that a lot of Christians kind of avoid, including a lot of Christian pastors and leaders and so on. They're almost afraid to even think in those terms. But we need to confront reality, and we are in the midst, and have been for generations, we're in the midst of a very intense culture war. And we'll talk about how it was present at the very beginning of American history, actually, very beginning of American colonial history. We'll talk about the early Christian influences in colonial America, including the First Great Awakening and the leaders in some of the major Christian movements and denominations. who were involved in the colonial era. Then we'll move on to Christianity, classical liberalism, and the American Revolution. Now, words like liberalism, of course, that's a man-made term, right? And so classical liberalism has virtually nothing in common with modern liberalism. Okay, modern liberalism is considerably more socialistic. Classical liberalism, we'll talk more about it, and it was basically the political foundation for the establishment of the American system of government. Okay, so classical liberal. By the way, what was classical conservatism?
That would be King George III.
Yeah, classical conservatism has virtually nothing to do with modern conservatism. So these man-made terms, they change over time. Now, classical conservatism was ruled by monarchy, hereditary monarchy, a very rigid class system, with very few exceptions. If you're born in a particular social class, especially a lower social class, that's your fate for the rest of your life. So a very rigid social class. And so you have monarchy, you have very strict social class delineations. And then another defining element of classical conservatism was a state church, an official state church. And of course, throughout most of European history, that was the Roman Catholic Church. And then we have in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation. And then you have official state churches emerge in Germany. That would have been what? What church in Germany? Lutheranism. You had official state churches in parts of Central Europe, Switzerland, and so on. And that was degrees of Calvinism, basically. In Scotland, it was what? Presbyterianism. In England, it was Anglicanism, and so on. And so those were all official state churches that in the past, all those areas of Europe had been controlled by Roman Catholicism. But with the Reformation and following, then you have these official established state Protestant churches. And so they try to import all of that to America, and they do to some extent. Like I said, at the time of the American Revolution, 9 of the 13 colonies had official state churches. And let's say you were a Baptist in Georgia. Well, you could very well be discriminated against, or in some cases, worse than that, if you did not belong to the official state church of the colony of Georgia. And so thank God the American Revolution did a lot to eliminate that. And the last official state church in America after the American Revolution was the Congregational Church in Massachusetts. And it remained the official state religion there in Massachusetts up until the early 1830s. But by then, all the other states had long, disbanded their state affiliation and all. And by the way, that meant that if you were a resident of Massachusetts, a citizen of Massachusetts, your tax money went to support the congregational establishment, whether you identified with that branch of Christianity or not. So that finally was broken in the 1830s. All right, we'll move on to talk about Christian and Enlightenment influences in the founding of the American nation. Many Christians have a very jaundiced negative view of the Enlightenment because, in fact, the Enlightenment did do a lot to corrupt the religion of Europe and here in America as well. But the Enlightenment also produced some very enlightened concepts on government and political theory. So it really is a mixed bag. And America benefited greatly from the Enlightenment influences when it came to the establishment of our system of government. Okay. Then we'll move on from there to Christianity and secularism in the 19th and 20th century. What makes this so complicated to work through is not only did you have more and more prominent Americans who were outright opponents and critics of Christianity, but you also have a trend even worse than that, and that is the liberalization of a lot of Protestant Christianity as well. And so kind of the enemy within. And so that actually started well before the 19th century, but it really magnifies itself over the last 200 years or so.
Name when that started, can you name? You said it started before the 19th century.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to consider, because why is it that almost every organization and institution, whether it's religious or secular, why do almost all of them, with some exceptions, always drift toward liberalism, secularism, and so on? And it would make for an interesting session to discuss. Why is that generally the case? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and we call that kind of a trend enculturation. In other words, Christians, and in that case, devout Jews, you're so influenced by the sociology of your environment. And there's a tendency to want to be accepted by others, especially others who are prominent in your society. And so it really takes a lot of intentional, concern on your part to understand that true Christianity has always been, to some extent or another, countercultural. Now, we use that term oftentimes back in the 1960s to talk about hippies and that sort of thing. Well, that was kind of an ersatz counterculture movement, but true Christianity's always been countercultural. And that's not emphasized nearly enough in our churches and institutions and so on. So Christianity and secularism in the 19th and 20th century, including the perversion, pollution of many of our great Christian denominations. And as you all know, just 3 or 4 years ago, the United Methodist Church, there was a major split that occurred. Mount Bethel Church over here was in the forefront of all that, and the conservatives split from the mainline UMC, United Methodist Church, and thank God they did that. And so to some extent, that sort of a movement has happened from time to time in American history, but what we witnessed 3 or 4 years ago was certainly one of the most widespread reactions to liberalism and the watering down of true Christianity. And then lastly, we'll take a look at our current American crisis and the state of affairs today. And whereas Christians, how can we make the greatest impact possible? Okay? Given the fact that secularization is becoming more and more of a force. We talked about George Soros, for instance, but we could probably identify hundreds of others who have this insidious agenda, anti-God agenda. And so we have to contend with that, and contend with it very honestly and directly, and with courage. So the major topics. Any questions or comments about any of that, and then we'll move on. Yes, Soren.
Been a fear my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my interest. But the word when we're talking about history, primary sources, extremely important when we're studying American history. Like, for example, the Civil War. When the Civil War we must go back to the primary sources and read what they say about the cause of the war, not what some liberal on TV tells us today that the cause was. And it's dangerous to believe history told to us these days because maybe they're not primary source.
Well, yes.
But you go back to primary sources, you'll get it right.
And every interpretation of history comes out of a particular worldview. And there are historians who, even non-Christian historians, who try to be scrupulously honest, in dealing with the facts. But then there are many others that are really just pushing a Marxist agenda.
I took American history in the 50s, in the late 40s and 50s in high school and grade school. And it was like primary sources. It was not apolitical, just strictly American history with nothing. I feel looking back, I was very fortunate to have that. Yeah,
it was taught considerably more, I'd say, honestly back then than it later became. Now, when I was in graduate school in the doctoral program, I was asked by the head of our department to teach at Spelman College for a year because one of the professors at Spelman was on sabbatical. So Spelman, is there in Atlanta. It's a black female college. And so I did that. Now, I didn't realize until several years later that there had been one of the most prominent historians of the 20th century who taught at Spelman College. Any clue? Pardon me? Oh, no, it was Howard Zinn. Now, do you know who Howard Zinn was or is? Yeah, he was probably the foremost Marxist American historian of the 20, or one of the most prominent. And in fact, I remember that later, as I got a position there at Georgia State, some of the more radical professors would use Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. I think that's what it was called. And then I understood a few years later that it is the #1 most popular American history textbook for college students. And it's written by this radical Marxist. And like I said, I was not aware of that when I was at Spelman, but that would have been interesting to interact with him and those who knew him. Okay. All right. So our current American crisis. Again, anything else, and then we'll move right on here. All right. Well, let's move then to the preface. And you should have there with you the outline. Does anyone need a copy? If so, let Donna know. But hopefully those of you online also were able to download that. If not, I have summarized it to an extent here in the slides for your benefit. All right, so I called this lead-in America's Perennial Culture War. Perennial meaning ongoing, okay? And we start with the whole idea of what the culture war is that we experience today. And it's basically all about two different worldviews, two conflicting worldviews, two incompatible worldviews. And I make the point that from its beginning, America's been a battleground between conflicting worldviews. At the outset, it pitted those who sought to build a new Jerusalem here in North America versus those who saw the new world as an opportunity for a new Babylon. And you have both types of people coming to America in the early stages. And as I wrote in my book, American Crisis, back in 2020, many people believe that America's culture war probably started in the 1960s with the emergence of the sexual revolution, the New Left, hippie counterculture, and so on. Others with a more extended view of history might take it back to the explosion of hedonism that characterized the Roaring Twenties right after World War I, or even the late 19th century with the rise of Darwinism and the secularization of American education. The secularization of American education didn't start in the 20th century, it started in the late 19th century. Some are aware that the revolutionary generation was divided not only by great political debates, but also by contrasting views of what kind of a nation America should be. What kind of a nation should we be socially, economically, religiously, and so on? But in fact, the origin of Americans' culture war predates all of that. It extends all the way back to virtually the very beginning, within a few years of the founding of Plymouth Colony, by the quote, Pilgrims, by a group of nonconformists, the Pilgrims, who by a group of nonconformists who came to establish a Christian community outside the authority of the Church of England. And then very quickly thereafter, there was another colony planted just a few miles north of Plymouth, and it was founded on what we would call very secularistic foundations, and the two almost from the outset didn't get along real well together. We'll go into that in more detail next week. But theologically and philosophically, what's at stake here generally is more or less a biblical theistic view or worldview versus that of secular humanism. Those two are totally incompatible. Ideologically, it was liberty, virtue, and individual responsibility versus libertarian individualism. Religiously, it was biblically based Christianity versus mere religiosity. Now, keep in mind, and again, this is so important, that all Europeans, with hardly any exceptions, all Europeans were, quote, Christians back then. They claimed to be Christians because, for centuries, all of Europe had been either Roman Catholic in the central and western parts or Orthodox in the eastern parts. So religiously, all Europeans, except the Jews, of course, and maybe a few others, would define themselves as Christians. But we know that Christianity is not just some kind of a religious identification. It's actually a living spiritual relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ. Now, many people, including Christians, are repelled today by the very notion of a culture war. You may have heard this in church. They argue we should just love one another and not judge one another or anything like that. They apparently don't have a clue what is going on and the significance of this great culture war that we're embroiled in. The reality of a culture war, however, it needs to be said, is really just a surface level manifestation of what the Bible defines or describes as spiritual warfare. So it starts with spiritual warfare, and then it manifests itself in every area of society and culture. But the essence of it is what the Bible defines as spiritual warfare. Now, as A.W. Tozer wrote, this world is a battlefield, not a playground. I mean, I remember reading that decades ago and thinking, I'm not sure I've ever read anything more profound than that. And yet it's rarely ever emphasized. And we think that our purpose here is to enjoy life as much as possible. And thankfully, in America, there is an awful lot of enjoyment that we can have. But this world is essentially a battlefield. It's not a playground. In other words, it's a spiritual struggle against evil forces. And we see those evil forces manifest each and every day in the news and so on. It's not a place for mere amusement or self-indulgence. Now, as the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 12:2, do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world. He's talking about the values, the priorities, the way of living of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and then you'll be able to discern God's good and pleasing and perfect will. But do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world. Now, that's a call for Christians to be countercultural. 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5 tells us, though we live in this world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of this world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish spiritual and moral strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So we call that, holistic, Christian discipleship. And then take note of Ephesians 6, 10-12. Be strong in the Lord and be strong in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take a stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood primarily, but against the rulers, the authorities, the powers of this dark world, talking about spiritual warfare, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So for secularists, though, and secular leftists in particular, whose ideology is steeped in the cesspool of Marxism, America's never been a nation of freedom and opportunity. America's been one in which our history has been rooted in violence, in conquest, and in exploitation. And that's all marked by racism, classism, social classism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, Islamophobia, and probably a whole variety of yet to be identified and unnamed isms and phobias, for that matter. While conceding that such social and cultural contagions are not uniquely American, leftists nonetheless argue that conservatives and Christians in particular have exploited all those evils for our own benefit as much as in any other nation in history. What we admire and are so thankful for when it comes to American culture and American history, they hate. And so look at what's going on in New York City today with some Mamdani and so on, and the agenda that he's promoting. Now, we know it's an absolute total failure. We know that from history, but nonetheless, they are just literally hell-bent and adamant on pushing that kind of an agenda. But for them, see, people like that, our history here in America is toxic and it's putrid. And again, they hate most of what we celebrate about America's traditions. Now, these two worldviews, a biblically based worldview versus a secular humanistic worldview, are the foundation for our moral, our political, our religious beliefs, and our practices. And so the contrast between a biblical and natural law-based moral absolutes versus libertine relativism and subjectivism, the constitutional government that balances the rule of law with the individual liberty versus moral libertinism and individualism, are what, clearly define these two alternative worldviews. And I'd say that probably the seminal issue, well, what would you say? When it comes down to it, is there one issue in particular that so clearly delineates a biblical Christian perspective on life and priorities as opposed to a secular view? Yeah, the right to life, the sanctity of human life. And, I've always said, if you encounter someone, a politician or whoever, and they are on the wrong side of that issue, this is not somebody you'd want to trust for much of anything. Okay, so, is human life sacred, Or is it just, ours to decide who lives and who dies based on our preferences? So it can't get any more fundamental than that. And, an individual, or by the way, a political party that supports, abortion, so-called abortion rights, is not a political party that you could trust on much of anything. Okay. Yes, Bruce.
Kind of a general comment, I think it'll be important to move into the next section here. But it's become extraordinarily difficult in the modern world to figure out what really is going on. So if they tell you that crime is down in Chicago, you'll find out that there's half the felonies that have been mischaracterized, recategorized as misdemeanors. It looks like crime is going down. My favorite, of course, is the redefinition of the word tolerance, just to mean that you agree with someone's point of view, but you disagreed with it. Now, you not only have to agree with it, you have to celebrate. Races become a totally empty term. If you take a black person's situation into account, you're a racist. If you don't take a black person's situation into account, you're a racist. So when you hear racial issues are on the rise in America, feel like I have absolutely no freaking idea. And so it's always the worst thing from a personal point of view. The worst thing that's happened to me as I mature. If you get to the point where if I hear something from what should be an authority figure, my immediate reaction is, well, maybe. Trust but verify, that's even too generous, right?
Yeah.
So it's just a very, very difficult thing to figure out.
Well, we're just inundated with propaganda, and it's overwhelmingly comes from one side, but not exclusively from one side, I might add. So, we need to be so immersed in a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview perspective, that we're aware of when we're being deceived.
Christian worldview itself is considered hate speech. If you say there are only two genders, you're guilty of hate speech.
Yeah.
So when you hear hate speech is on the rise, well, who knows?
Yeah, and the Democratic Party, which has always touted itself as the party of science, they are the most culpable when it comes to tolerating or sanctioning, transgenderism and all, even though it's totally antithetical to biological nature, So when it comes to these sorts of things, people will use whatever terminology and whatever distorted logic necessary to push their agenda. So we need to be, very discerning people and understand that we're just inundated with lies and distortions on a regular basis. Yes,
Well,
Oren, and then we'll go to John here.
Yeah, on following what Philip was saying, what I see in these words like racism or these trigger words, other, extremists, and the funny one all is Nazi, they don't even know what that means. But that's having studied somewhat Marxist techniques for entering a nation and trying to divide it and stir up trouble, cause divisions. Words like racism and those kind of words are what they use to create that. And what they did in this country, they saw one of the weaknesses they thought was black versus white, that racial divide there.
Sure.
They worked to try to increase that division, and they'll use these trigger words like that. And many people will pick up on that and use them, not understanding what's going on. And so the key is, it is really important that our school system go through a bad curriculum change that will teach our children when they graduate from high school, that they understand these principles of what's going on in the world, why socialism fails, and what's the history of socialism, why their economies don't make it, why they tend to go into dictatorship. And we're not being taught that. And my high school now, American history is no longer key category at the top, like with mathematics, English. Over here, it's social studies, and down here below that, somewhere down there is American history. And it used to be at the top level when I went there, and
Yeah.
the children, they don't have a clue what's going on.
Yeah.
And you have to be
Well,
discerning.
and
You're going to be a discerning voter, you've got to be educated, and they're not.
That's the whole point.
well, and
To be discerning voters.
yeah.
not to Be robots.
that's correct. And I think as conscientious Christians, we'd want to use words correctly, not just to further our agenda. And of course, they will do that. You know, words like tolerance and racism and all that sort of thing. They don't oftentimes even understand what those terms mean, but it's just to promote their agenda. They're just not intellectually or morally honest people. So,
They're not video more.
John, you.
Oh, you're not, they don't even, they don't know.
Oh,
what that means.
that's absurd. Yes. Yes.
For me,
Yeah.
all my life, I've gotten to the point at age 85 where what I see, having read so much, is fear.
Mhm.
I've gotten to this point where I shouldn't have that kind of feeling because I'm a Christian, but I'm really, really concerned.
Mhm.
And the main concern is that our voters don't know how to vote.
Mhm.
And because they're not educated.
Mhm.
They have
Yeah.
no discernment.
Yeah.
So they're led by these demagogues from the stage who will tell them these lies and things, and they'll tend to believe it. And so
They're poorly educated, but they're also very, very poorly educated in church because very few churches ever, address these kind of issues. And I think it's either out of ignorance, they don't understand how important these matters are. In other words, if we believe in, holistic discipleship, comprehensive discipleship, well, that extends into every area of life, doesn't it? Even into very messy areas of life like politics. Still, we have a responsibility to extend our faith into that field. But so either out of ignorance or just cowardice, because these are all controversial issues. Now, if you think about it, has there ever been a more controversial person in all of human history than Jesus Christ? Okay. So aren't we supposed to be like Jesus and not just hide behind safe facades? So, John, you were going to.
I think the self-based worldview is based on the Bible with 1,500 years, 40 different authors and stuff. But the whole secular humanistic worldview, is there anything that comes close to one book or compendium of books that would encapsulate that, or is it so self-changing over the years that it's impossible to encapsulate it?
Well, you're talking about secular humanism itself. There's been so much written, and of course, I wrote a lot about it in my book, American Crisis. Oh, that espoused that worldview. I'm
evolved over time,
Yeah.
it changes.
Well, so much of what pours out of academia in the social sciences does address those issues, but it addresses them from a secularistic, point of view.
So you really can't put it in a book or a compendium of books, if you would, to say this is what it is.
Just not off the top of my head, but for any college student who's majoring in, social studies, social sciences, history, political philosophy, sociology, psychology, whatever, they're just being flooded with all of that. And not all of it is explicitly anti-Christian, but a lot of it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, let's move on here. And so as I noted here in this slide, these two worldviews, a biblical theistic worldview and a secular humanistic worldview, are the foundation for all of our cultural, moral, political, religious beliefs and practices. And essentially, people generally fall into one or the other category. Even people that oftentimes claim to be Christians, but again, they've never thought biblically about these matters. Again, problem is enculturation, and we're just constantly inundated with secular humanistic values and beliefs and priorities and so on. All right, so let's move on here and talk about one prime example of that dramatizes America's 21st century culture war, and that would be the 1619 Project. You probably remember a little bit about that. It came and went fairly quickly, fortunately, but the residue remains. And this is one of the most recent, one of the most influential left-wing deconstructions of American history. That's the 1619 Project. It was developed by the New York Times staff, and the most prominent person in its development, if you want to call it a development, was a New York Times author by the name of Nicole Hannah-Jones. Now, Hannah-Jones is a Marxist. She's also a very race-obsessed activist whom the mainstream media likes to describe as an investigative journalist. But in fact, she's just a racialist. In other words, she sees everything through a racial prism. Okay. And, people like that are never to be trusted, to say the least. She functions under the premise that America was founded and built primarily on racism, and primarily on the exploitation of Africans in particular, of course. And the goal of this 1619 Project was to manufacture, in her words, quote, a new origin story for America, a new origin story. So we've had it wrong all these centuries, and we need her help. It also connected in her mind, historical injustices to contemporary issues, demonstrating how the legacy of slavery continues to influence our nation today. Okay. Now, the project had two stated agendas: constructing, quote, a more complete history of America and a more truthful and complete account of American history, while fostering pride in Black history. Okay. So you see that teaching Black history is necessary and proper. We need to know it. But when that seems to be the primary objective, then it's cause for some concern. The result was a radical revisionist theory of America based on the premise that the true founding of America did not occur in 1620 with the founding of Plymouth Colony by the Pilgrims, but rather in 1619 with the importation of the first African slaves. Now, the theory put forth by the 1619 Project, which Hannah-Jones described as a radical reframing of American history, was immediately denounced by many professional American historians, most of whom are liberals, but they saw that this is really out of bounds. They considered it to be a politicized perversion of America's founding. Also, in reality, the status, by the way, of these first Africans, that first shipload of Africans who were unloaded at Jamestown in 1619, there's some confusion about exactly what their status was, by the way. In reality, even though they were generally referred to as slaves, they were originally purchased apparently as indentured servants. But I should say they were involuntary indentured servants, unlike the voluntary indentured servants who came over to America. But anyway, at least to some extent, these original Africans were considered indentured servants. We don't know when that generally translated into, quote, lifelong slavery, but some of them, we know, there in Jamestown, later became landowners themselves and even purchased slaves themselves. So it's a lot more complicated than it's oftentimes, portrayed. Now, among the numerous misstatements in the 1619 Project, it claimed that one of the primary reasons that the colonists decided to declare independence from Great Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. Well, there's no evidence for that. In a letter published in the New York Times in December of 2019, several prominent historians acknowledged, quote, all efforts to address the enduring centrality of slavery and racism in our history. That needs to be taken seriously. But they also expressed strong reservations about certain aspects of the 1619 Project, including accusing the authors of, quote, a displacement of historical understanding by ideology. In other words, this whole thing obviously is just pushing a racialist agenda. And so, its validity and its honesty needs to seriously be considered. But nonetheless, in 2020, the New York Times premiered a podcast series on the 1619 Project, and Hannah Jones was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for her introductory essay. Okay, she's a darling in the intellectual left-wing intellectual establishment. Now, there have been a lot of conservative responses to the 1619 Project, and some of them have been quite direct and rather unequivocal. For instance, one of the contributors on NBC News is a moderate conservative by the name of Bret Stephens. He's also a columnist for the New York Times. And Bret Stephens objected to the radical revisionist nature of the 1619 Project, including its mischaracterization of Abraham Lincoln's views on race. They accused Lincoln also of being a racist. Well, early in his career, apparently he was. But by the time he became president and during his presidency, he apparently had moderated his views on race. Now, by the way, most everybody was racist back then. And but there were some who understood, and oftentimes because of their Christian commitments, that racism, is invalid for a Christian, and we should not think in those terms. Writing from National Review magazine, Rich Lowry noted that the 1619 Project conveniently omitted certain embarrassing facts about the slave trade. Embarrassing facts such as it was the Africans who went into the hinterlands and captured other Africans, marched them to the coast, and sold them for profit to European slave traders. So back in the 1970s, there was a TV series that came out, Roots. Yeah, Alex Haley, was that his name? And in Roots, if I remember correctly, it's a bunch of Europeans who land on the coast and they sneak into, Africa, into the jungle areas and capture a bunch of, black people, put them in chains, bring them back, load them on their ships and take off. Well, apparently that rarely happened. It probably did happen to some extent, but almost all the time, it's a deal that struck with African slave traders themselves. In summary, the Washington Post columnist George Will called the 1619 Project malicious and historically illiterate. And by the end of the summer of 2021, 27 Republican majority states had introduced bills condemning the 1619 Project. And in Florida in particular, Governor Ron DeSantis had the whole project banned, along with critical race theory in general. Ron DeSantis, has there ever been, honestly, a greater governor in American history? Not that I'm aware of. No. Very admirable man, very courageous. Well, the 1619 Project is merely one example of how radical leftists revise history to fit their insidious agenda. See, truth means nothing to these people. They've got an agenda to push. Unfortunately, many in academia, the media, the entertainment industry, corporate America, and even in ministry, many promote this propaganda, either mindlessly or intentionally. The cumulative impact is that it distorts the truth of American history. Christians, therefore, need to be well informed, well equipped, and courageous in opposing this kind of propaganda that's corrupting, every aspect of American life. No one should ever try to sanitize American history. And this is something that Christians sometimes have done over the last, couple of generations. You read some of these histories, and it's very much of a literally whitewash of American history. Like other nations, like all other kingdoms and political entities that have ever existed, there is plenty to criticize about America and about America's past. But see, the critics always have the advantage because nothing's perfect in this life, well, except my wife. And don't you say anything. Don't you dare. No, nothing's perfect in this life. So the critics always have the advantage, no matter how admirable or good something is, it's never perfect. But we have to understand that that it's irrational to compare America and American history with some concept of perfection. Instead, we compare it to every other nation that's ever existed. And in that sense, it truly is outstanding. And that's the basis on which we have to think and operate. America's never been perfect, nor has it consistently lived up to its founding principles. Instead, it's merely been, by comparison, the most just, the most free, and in many respects, the best nation in human history in terms of opportunity. And for that, we should be extremely, grateful. So with that, let me sort of draw things to a conclusion for our session this evening. Any comments, further comments, questions?
I think racism is what you were calling is just another sin.
It is.
There's sin everywhere, and racism is one of them.
Absolutely.
And so when we talk about passing a law to prevent racism, it's kind of ridiculous to do that. It's just something.
Now, racial discrimination's another matter. You can pass laws preventing that, but you can't control how people think. Yeah. What's that? Well, and that's why in my book, American Crisis, I wrote quite a bit. I address the issue of racism, of course, because it's important. You have to. But it seems like more than racism, what we face today is racialism, and that is processing everything through a racial prism. And that's really sick, morally sick, intellectually sick, and so on. But we have to keep in mind that the secular humanists, the left, and so on, these people are extremely clever, and and to the extent that they oftentimes, are evil to deceive people who otherwise perhaps wouldn't agree with some of their agendas. So we're dealing with people who are, by modern humanistic standards, highly educated, oftentimes, and very, very clever. And that's why, Christians need to be well informed and, able to discern truth from lies and truth from propaganda and so on. Bruce, yes.
one step in sort of dealing with all this stuff. We had Mary Graybar here a couple of years ago.
Mhm.
Interesting way that she was born in Slovenia, but moved to the United States, got a PhD in English lit,
Mhm.
Georgia.
Yeah.
And then ultimately has seemed to have found a niche for herself writing books, debunking all this stuff.
Mhm.
And she wrote a book about Howard Zinn's People's History of America.
Yeah,
She wrote debunking the 1719,
1619, yeah.
And apparently the book online, she has a book either just come out or about to called Debunking FDR.
Oh.
I'm sure that he was third about it. Debunking.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's appropriate. It's appropriate.
Well, after I got to know Mary, I remember I thought about writing a book debunking Mary Graybar. No, she's very impressive. Yeah, but yeah. Hmm. So, any other thoughts? So we'll close things out. Those of you joining us online, any comments, questions you'd like to interject? Okay. Well, nice having you all with us, and those of you who joined us in person here. And like I said at the outset, the church did not somehow they failed to get the news about our course publicized. I got a call right before our class, and they were very apologetic. So hopefully that'll be rectified, and hopefully we'll have more join us next week and all.
You know, one comment,
Mhm.
you were talking all the negatives in our country because we're sinner and we're not perfect,
Mhm.
but in our declaration and the words in our constitution, they're not holy words, so they're not biblical, but they state ideals that are ideals that you won't find in any other country.
Mhm.
And we don't live up to those ideas necessarily, but they're in writing. And
Yes.
that's our goal and what we say we stand by, and it does mean something.
It does.
We're not perfect.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, they were influenced by the Enlightenment intellectualism of their day, but they also were very much influenced by the Bible and Christian thought. And these were people, even people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, James Monroe, people like that were extremely well versed in the Bible, whether they believed everything about it or not. And so, unlike today, when biblical ignorance is so pervasive, these are people that were extremely well read and well educated, at least, the top echelon of our founding fathers and all. So, Jennifer, any protests?
I think Jeffrey, form.
She gives me a stack every month or two.
I'd say Tim one, why the jihad is in the tree. And is it really every tree? I'm gonna get this critique on that. But there's some others here for you, Jeffrey. The music biopic, Dead. And then there was another one. Speaking of the university.
A biopic, you say, on what?
Well, Bruce gets it, so he knows what's happening here. So anyway, yeah.
Universities can't be neutral. Yeah, I mean, we either operate out of a biblically based mindset or a secular humanistic mindset. Yeah. Yes, Donna.
Could you comment on Mandami taking his oath on the Quran, which just is just guttural and terrible? And I mean, I just curious your thoughts. Did you find it as appalling?
Sure.
It's just
Sure, it's damnable.
Keith Ellison, Attorney General in Minnesota, the right-hand man to what
Walls. Yeah.
took his oath that office on Jefferson Park.
Oh, did he really?
That was wrong.
So explain why. Well, explain, this is, the Bible, the Gospels that were edited by Thomas Jefferson. So explain what the problem is.
He went to that whole miracle. Yeah. Well, having said that, we were fortunate to be up in Washington visiting what our youngest daughter at the time on our hand. And, we went to the Library of Congress. I had never been, and it's been really impressive. Can't get in the stack, but you can see it. And it's got some exhibits and so on and so on, but they do have things in Jefferson Library, which he donated to form the original.
That's right.
It's a mess. Absolutely. The big giant, but this big around. Okay, like all like that, 4 stories tall. Wow, unbelievable. He was quite a
Yes.
His book collection also formed the library at the University of Virginia. Yeah, as well. Well, the problem with Jefferson Bible, yeah, as Bruce mentioned and all, is Jefferson did not believe in miracles, including the miracle of the resurrection. So he ends the Gospels with Jesus being crucified and buried. End of story. Okay. And I was up there in Monticello a few years ago, and I went into the bookstore and I bought the Jefferson Bible. And I remember when I was checking out, I told the woman behind the counter, this took a lot of audacity, to edit, the Gospels. And she just gave me this blank, uncomprehending stare. Huh? But
He did. I listened to, yeah.
what was the topic?
Well,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
collectivism and whatever. We're gonna use that a lot.
Yes.
That's another example of one collective. Taking half my property value.
Exactly.
Well, that's how valid concepts like freedom of religion, get perverted and distorted by people. But what's the alternative? Throwing them in prison for doing so.
Jeffrey, the other thing is the word liberty. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead and we'll close things out here. Yeah.
Media and all probably exploited liberty in this country, adding hard work to that, and being able to educate myself through the university to become what I was with Lockheed. And that was only because I lived in this country. Elsewhere, it would have been unlikely because we were very poor, but this country, I'm an example of what you can do if you just bear down hard work because the freedom is there.
Yes.
And that's a really a big deal. And
it really
millions of us have followed that route to success. And let's not forget that aspect. It's not at fault, period. It's one of the wonderful things this country does have that we can brag about.
Yes. And yet we know human nature is so flawed, and so liberty can be so distorted and perverted, and it becomes libertinism, which is, unrestricted, self actions and so on.
So like justice, we hear these other words like justice,
yes,
and jobs and social justice, and we get confused because we're not educated. We're not able to see what's in front of our face because we're not educated.
Well, again, the secularists and leftists are very clever. Yeah. And so the greatest book ever written on social justice is the Bible. But they have co-opted that term and corrupted that term as they do so much.
They take advantage of our ignorance.
That's right.
If we weren't ignorant and uneducated, we wouldn't fall for that 1690 stuff. But we do because they're not teaching us in school. what we need to learn.
Correct. Correct. Well, wonderful being with you all this evening, and we have a lot more to come. I think you'll find it again to be very valuable and very interesting. So thank you and look forward to next week being with you all as we take the next step into the first part of our study for the semester.
Thank you, Jim. That was very, the topic is just perfect for the time.
Boy,
And I just wish we could have had several analysis.
yes.
You're doing there.
Well, we just hope to have, as much of an influence as possible and